Hello and welcome back to my channel. So in the last few weeks I've done quite complicated kind of readings or interpretations, or before I was doing lots of research, and this week I just wanted to go back to basics, and I'm going to close read some poetry with you, for you, with you. As a result, there are no spoilers unless you're chronologically reading the works of John Keats and you only just started. One of the reasons that I wanted to talk about poetry in particular is that I know that it's something that people find really difficult to engage with, or some people find really difficult to engage with. And I just wanted to model that it's really about just looking at what is on the page. It is almost a scientific observation. You look at what is there, you deduce what is there. It's actually quite mathematical in some ways, and then you read for meaning. And it's not like some ambiguous, unattainable something that you're looking for. It's something quite specific. So I wanted to have a go at that with you and show you sort of what I do with my students. In order to do this, I have chosen a poem by John Keats. John Keats is a poet that I teach to my students who are 16, 17. We do like a whole block on romantics, and we do all the romantic poets, and we do Frankenstein, things like that. I don't know all of his poems, this is just the major works, and it's quite juicy. But I do know some of them, and I know how to approach them, and that is what I want to get to today. I've chosen for this exercise to look at his poem called On First Looking into Chapman's Homer. Much have I travelled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told, that deep-browed Homer ruled as his demesne. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene, till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. The first question when you work with a poem is always, what is it about? Now sometimes, particularly if you go into the 20th century, we'll probably encounter this if I talk about modernism, and I will talk about modernism. Sometimes what the poem is about is quite difficult to discern, but most of the time it's not. And here, it is not. It is actually very, very clear. In fact, the title of the poem tells us what it is about. It is about John Keats reading Chapman's translation of Homer's works. And I wanted to read you, to sort of back up this picture of him reading Chapman's works, some notes from this collection that I think sort of illuminate that picture. So the poem was composed in 1816 and it was published in the Examiner. And Cowden Clarke recalls the memorable night on which he introduced Keats to Chapman's translation of Homer, and was rewarded by one of Keats' delighted stares at the line, "The ship had soaked his heart through," from the description of Ulysses' shipwreck. This is the Odyssey. Keats composed the sonnet immediately after this all-night session, and delivered it to Cowden Clarke before breakfast. Hunt's view was that this sonnet, which terminates with so energetic a calmness, completely announced the new poet taking possession. George Chapman's The Whole Works of Homer was published in 1614. It is significant that Keats and most of his contemporaries, though not Byron, should have favoured this translation and not the more recent one by Pope. So it really is about a moment of elation at discovering something beautiful in literature. Pretty straightforward, really. Number 2, what kind of poem is this? So when you look at the poem on the page, it has this very distinct, almost square shape. And when a poem looks almost square on the page, it usually means it's a sonnet. Because of the form of the sonnet, on the page when they're printed, they look quite square, and so this is a good indicator. However, we do need to test this theory to see if it really is a sonnet. The first thing is that all sonnets have 14 lines, and this poem does indeed have 14 lines. So, Good work so far. The second thing is that sonnets are written in pentameter, usually in iambic pentameter, although you can find other pentameters in sonnets. But pentameter means that there are 5 feet per line, which usually means there are 5 strong beats per line. So we can test this as well. So let's read and count the strong beats. And the reading is going to sound a little strained, but it will demonstrate what I'm trying to get across. So, much have I travelled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. I don't need to go on. I think that demonstrates the 5 and the strong pulses. So that's pretty much confirmed it. We know now that this is a sonnet. It is a 14-line poem in pentameter. Sonnet. However, we now need to discern what kind of sonnet it is. Now, obviously, sonnets have been played around with a lot. All forms of poetry have been played around with a lot since they sort of came into being. But in classical literature, there are 2 types of sonnet. There are Petrarchan sonnets and there are Shakespearean sonnets. And you can tell which type of sonnet it is by looking at the rhyme scheme. Shakespearean sonnets are comprised of 12 lines in alternate rhyming couplets and 2 lines at the end that are a rhyming couplet. For example, Sonnet 18, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? And you can see down the side here that we have alternate rhyming couplets and 1 rhyming couplet. So we know that that is a Shakespearean sonnet, not just because it was written by Shakespeare, which is a pretty good indicator as well. Petrarchan sonnets, which are actually the older of the 2 forms, vary a little bit. They always begin with 2 enclosed rhymes. So an enclosed rhyme is an A, B, B, A. So the A's are enclosing those B lines. And the last 6 lines can vary, but on the whole, they are commonly in alternate rhyming triplets. So C, D, C, D, C, D. This is what we have with this poem. We have A, B, B, A, B, B, A, C, D, C, D, C, D. So we know that it is a Petrarchan sonnet. Next up, the other really important, and I think possibly most important element of a sonnet is the turn. After the first 8 lines, the poem changes tone. It changes perspective, or it changes in its mood. Sometimes it changes in the emotions of the person speaking the sonnet. So I would like to read you this sonnet again so that you can hear the turn. Much have I travelled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told, that deep-browed Homer ruled as his demesne, yet did I never breathe its pure serene, till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. So in this poem, the first 8 lines are really a reflection on what has come before, leading up to this moment of discovering Chapman's translation of Homer. And then the last 6 lines are an experience, a new experience. They're a description of this elation and awe that the speaker feels upon discovering this new text. Another signifier of the turn is often a word. So in this poem, the first word of the 9th line is then. And then is we're moving on to a new space. That is a word that takes you from one idea to another. So now we understand our form. We have to ask, what does the form tell us about the poem? What relationship do form and content have with each other? As I said, sonnets are a very classical form. They're also a very, very strict form. They are rigid and they are extremely difficult to write. Of all the poetry I've ever tried to write, sonnets, I think, are the most challenging for the most people. Keats didn't always write in such classical ways. He was using more contemporary forms to his time. And he also wrote a lot of very short, sort of playful verses. So he was not married to these grand archetypal forms. But the fact that he uses one here is absolutely appropriate to the content of the poem. Chapman's The Whole Works of Homer, as you heard in the reading, was published in 1614, and most people in the 19th century were reading Alexander Pope's translations by then, but not the poets. The poets mostly preferred Chapman's. So Keats is looking back at an older work, and of course it is also an older work of an ancient work. Homer is classical literature. I mean, Homer falls into the category of classics. So he's absolutely lives in this grand tradition. And Homer also wrote in very structured, rigid forms. But Keats doesn't write in Homer's form. Homer was writing in dactylic hexameter, which is also extremely difficult to write in. And if you want to know more about poetic feat, I would go and do some research. But just believe me that dactylic hexameter is quite tricky. Although I do wonder if it's easier in Greek, if it lends itself more easily to the Greek language. So Keats is not writing in Homer's form. He's not going so far back as to write in a Homeric verse. He is writing in a fairly typical 16th century, 17th century form, i.e. the sonnet. So he is actually writing in a form that lived in Chapman's world, which I think is really nice because the poem is really speaking to the power of the translator and not so much the power of the original text. So using that classic form to pay homage to Chapman is absolutely appropriate here. Sonnets are of Chapman's time. So let's talk a little bit about language. Language in poetry is obviously always very important and very, very considered. And I think that in this poem, the language does three distinct things and an infinite number of other things, but we'll stick with three today because time is finite. So on the one hand, you have this language that is extremely noble and heavenly. He uses terms like realms of gold, goodly states and kingdoms seen, in fealty to Apollo. Realms of gold is obviously a heavenly picture, and Apollo is a god, and I think that these goodly states and kingdoms in between and the relationship between god and kings is very evident that this is a heavenly and noble picture. He also uses language that suggests a huge amount of space. He starts the poem with "Much have I travelled." He says, "Round many western islands have I been." He describes himself as being like some watcher of the skies, and he describes Cortez, he stared at the Pacific. So we have this huge sense of an expanse of space spreading around this poem. And this poem is, it's small and short. It's just this little sonnet form, and yet it feels extremely expansive. Finally, and I think this perhaps is the most important element because of the feeling of the poem, he uses phrases that really elicit awe. So he says, "Yet did I never breathe its pure serene, till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold." And he says, "Then felt I like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken." And he says, "And all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise." Which are really just three pictures of these moments of discovery and awe and inspiration that I think imbue the whole poem and are really what has inspired the poem. So if we follow this thought further and we look at the awe of the poem and we say that the poem is really, it's about Keats first discovering Chapman, but it is also really about the awe that he feels upon reading Chapman. And if we follow that thought through, we can look at the whole poem in a new way. Let me do this in sections now. I will read it again. So first of all, we have a demonstration of great admiration for what has come before, what he has read previously, presumably Pope. "Much have I travelled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told, that deep-browed Homer ruled as his demesne." So despite the fact that we know that the poem is going to go on to celebrate the work of Chapman, there's no question that the work that has come before, that Keats has read before, is also worthy of awe and inspiration. And the fact that he gives such a beautiful picture of what he has already experienced goes on to really emphasize what comes next. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene, till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. This sense of awe is amplified. We know immediately that it is even more impressive than what has come before. And he doesn't really even describe what it's like reading Chapman. He only compares it with what has gone before favourably, and then goes on to explain his own personal experience. So again, this is what comes after the turn. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. These last few lines have a really strong, awed sense of looking out into the world. And he also makes use of simile here, as if describing the experience is not enough. He needs to compare it with something that we will understand immediately as being grand and awe-inspiring. These moments of discovery of Cortez, looking at the Pacific, or of astronomers discovering new stars, these incredible moments of discovering that the world is bigger, that it has something more. Those are the pictures that he gives us to describe how he feels in his room reading a book. And I think what's particularly beautiful, and what is picked up in the notes that I read, is that it ends with silence. Silent upon a peak in Darien. It is like a hushed awe. It's almost a holy church kind of awe. And that's it, basically. The more you look at poems, the more they all reveal to you. And I could probably do another video on this poem and go into more depth and look at each word more particularly. But in terms of taking an approach, it is really just about knowing your forms and thinking about them in their context. It's not magic, it's poetry. Thank you for watching. If you like what I'm doing, then please subscribe. I pointed the wrong side of the screen last week, but I think it's down there. And if you want to engage with me more directly, you can of course comment below, or you can follow me on Twitter @StellaOtwill. I'll see you next week.